Everybody get a maroon hymnal and turn to page 194. 194, Jesus is coming soon. Let's everybody stand, please. Turn to page 151. What a day that will be.
Familiar face here with us tonight, Brother Russ. It's so good to have you, and welcome tonight. It's good to have you tonight. Tonight it's been a long while since we've been, but you can be turning in the book of Malachi. We have had just a wonderful, just a period in which we've had several testimonies, really since January. January is when we started the testimonies. I don't know, maybe you forgot. We started with myself, Miss Bonnie, and it just kept on going. We still have at least 3 more that are going to give their testimony, hopefully, Lord willing, but we're going to schedule them. But if you would, please turn to the last book in the Old Testament, the book of Malachi. Just to give you a little bit of background on it, it means my messenger, my messenger. Now, it's like I said, last book Old Testament, so you can turn to Matthew, turn to the left, and you'll find it. It's not a very long book. It's only 4 chapters long. And it's a book that really talks about the attitude of the people of God towards their God. You have in the first chapter, God goes ahead and tells his people, if you look at chapter 1, verse 2, he says, "Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord, yet I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau." Now, we talked about this when we had our sermon on that section, but those terms are love or the lack of love in action. God actually went ahead and blessed Israel, but they still complained. They still complained. He says in verse 6, "A son honors his father and a servant his master. Then if I am a father, where is my honor?" He says in verse 7, "You are presenting defiled food." Verse 8, "But when you present the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil?" Verse 13, "You also say, my, how tiresome it is, and you disdainfully sniff at it." Now this is something where the people of God, they would bring their offerings to the Lord. I don't know, maybe you didn't realize this, but when they would have a sacrifice, the fat portion would be offered up to the Lord, and then the priest would take some of the meat, but some of the meat would be left for the actual person who offered it up to partake of. And so it was actually, kind of like we have get-togethers and we have big meals, and we're going to be doing so this next week. It's similar to that. They would actually present their offerings, and then they would partake in it. But they say, "Oh, it's tiresome," and you disdainfully sniff at it. And then he moves on to the priest in chapter 2, and "This commandment now is for you, O priest," and he begins to talk about how the priests have not been faithful in commanding the people. He says, "I'm going to behold," verse 3, "I'm going to rebuke your offspring, and I will spread refuse on your faces." He's pretty frank with them. Go to verse 6. He's speaking of how Aaron, the tribe of Levi, and Aaron, his sons, the priest, how they used to be. He says in verse 6 of chapter 2, "True instruction was in his mouth, and unrighteousness was not found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness, and he turned many back from iniquity." That's the way the priests are supposed to be. Verse 7, "For the lips of a priest should preserve knowledge, and men should seek instruction from his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts." Verse 8 and 9, "But as for you, you have turned aside from the way. You have caused many to stumble by the instruction. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, says the Lord of hosts. So I also have made you despised and abased before all the people, just as you are not keeping my ways, but are showing partiality in the instruction." And so he moves from the people in general. He says to the people, "You have not followed me. You're not giving me your best. You complain and say, 'Lord, how do you love us?'" And then he moves on to the priest. And he says, "You, priest, have not faithfully instructed my people." And now he moves to the family. And I have to say, so I, as a preacher of God's Word, make it my practice to not harp on the days. I don't try to harp on the news, is what I'm trying to say. If I see something on the news one week, I try not to harp on it. And I try rather, because God has spoken through His Word, I try rather to expound what has actually God said, because most people have had enough of the news cycle and would rather actually hear what the Bible has to say. And so I don't typically harp on the goings-on of the day. But having said that, if there was one thing that we could point to, it is that things have changed and are changing with families, with the family unit. And so let's read what he says to them in chapter 2 in verse 10 of Malachi and following. And this is where we're actually going to begin our text tonight. He says, "Do we not all have one Father? Has not one God created us? Why do you deal treacherously, each against his brother, so as to profane the covenant of our fathers. Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord, which he loves, and has married the daughter of a foreign god. As for the man who does this, may the Lord cut off from the tents of Jacob everyone who awakes and answers or who presents an offering to the Lord of hosts. What's the problem in this section? It's marrying people who are not God's people. Now, this is something we have to tread lightly on and understand correctly. There are several in the lineage of Jesus even who are non-Jewish. So God is not somehow racist here, and he is not wanting the people of Israel to marry within themselves because he's a racist. Rather, God does not want to see, if you'll go back in the Old Testament and read, why did God say not to marry the Canaanites who are in the land? It wasn't because they're a different race and we don't want that. No, it's because they will cause your hearts to go after their gods. And it's illustrated all throughout the Old Testament. If you look at Solomon with his 700